Perfect. So welcome. We are at class 11 in our trek through Jewish history, and we made it 20 weeks. So for those who are wondering, I think initially it was supposed to be 10 weeks. And then I think at week 4 or 5, when we realized we were still in the Iron Age, we realized we probably had to tack on a couple more weeks. So just to give a brief overview and summary like we do every week, so we know where we are. This is our third and final chapter in the medieval period. And we've been focusing on, for the last couple of classes, mostly medieval Spain. 2 sessions ago, we talked about a little bit of the differences between Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and the Mizrahi community, and some of the different sociological and ideological forces that were acting on the different communities. Then last week, we talked all about Maimonides and the Rambam and his philosophic rationalism that he brought to Judaism. And so today we are going to basically take the opposite side of the coin and talk about this in a way that pits everything we're going to do today actually against Maimonides and everything he stood for. Because one way to think of this is in medieval Spain, and this is something we've been talking about for the last 2 sessions, there were a ton of intellectual and ideological forces that were to some extent challenging religion from a Greek philosophic level. And so to some extent, you have a few choices there, right? And this is not dissimilar to even today when certain ideological ideas come and conflict Judaism. One, you can say Judaism is fully reconcilable with whatever those other ideas might be, right? That's Maimonides' approach, right? Maimonides thought that you can fully accept all of the truth claims of Judaism, fully accept all of the truth claims of science, or at least what was science in his time, and there is no contradiction there. You could take the complete opposite direction, which is you can reject one of them. So you can either say, well, if science is contradicting stuff in Judaism, let's throw out Judaism. Or of course, you can say if science is contradicting something in Judaism, let's throw out science, right? That's another very dogmatic view. Or you can have some worldview in the middle that almost says, well, there are some things in religion that I will take the truth claims of and something in science, but when they mess, there's more of a gray area. And so today we're going to focus a lot more in that gray area, because as a reaction to this sort of rationalistic revolution that we spoke about in our last session, there were obviously a lot of Jewish thinkers that didn't agree with Maimonides. I think our fun fact from last session was Maimonides' philosophy and his book, Guide to the Perplexed, was actually the most burned book by Jews of a Jewish author in history. And so in the Middle Ages, right after he published his Guide to the Perplexed, you can imagine this book being sent around to all of the Jewish communities, both throughout wider Europe and the world. And lots of community leaders saw these books, they started to read it, and they burned them. And even to some extent today, if you go into a lot of ultra-Orthodox yeshivot, and I think I mentioned this in the last session, everybody studies Maimonides for his halachic contributions, but almost nobody in the ultra-Orthodox world studies Maimonides for his philosophic contributions. And so even Maimonides as a figure, and this we spoke about last time again, is a very complex and torn figure in the sense of a lot of, especially the ultra-Orthodox community that today has adopted the worldview of if science and Judaism conflict, you reject science. Maimonides is a very difficult figure for them. And so a lot of them purposely cut out the philosophic side of Maimonides. Now, on the flip side, because there was such a wave of rationalism and philosophy, there were also movements that started popping up in medieval Spain, especially, that were anti-philosophy and anti-rationalism. And this is where we start to talk about what people call Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. And so today we're going to introduce Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. I'm going to focus on 3 historic figures that really brought Judaism from its, shall we say, pre-mystic or pre-Kabbalistic era until basically what we know today to be Kabbalah. I want to say one more preliminary thought, just because I think this makes for just interesting background on the scholarship here. So for a very long time in Judaism, and when I mean very long time, I mean for the last multi-hundred years, the study of Kabbalah, or even the talking about Kabbalah, was almost seen as a third rail of Judaism. And what I mean by that is Jewish leaders for the past several hundred years have been writing off the mystic parts of Judaism as sort of, I'll say it in the offensive way, as folklore for the masses, while the real intellectual Jews, the real elites, they're the ones studying philosophy, they're the ones studying Talmud, and all the masses over there that, aren't sharp enough or wise enough to really understand philosophy or Jewish law, halacha, or Talmud, will leave Kabbalah to them. And there was actually a really big anti-mystical movement, right? And we'll actually talk about that in 2 sessions. During the early Hasidic movement took a lot from Kabbalistic ideas, and there was a huge backlash to that. But one of the reasons why today we actually know as much about Kabbalah as we do is because in the early 20th century, a scholar named Gershom Scholem, who is a very well-known Jewish academic, basically decided that he would start to study Kabbalah from an academic perspective. And he really spent his life trying to understand in an academic type of way the ideas of Kabbalah, how they arose, and really try to create a more nuanced picture than Kabbalah being, again, this tool for the masses, and actually use it as a positive framework or a really interesting philosophy of Judaism. Just one more interesting story, because I always love this. So most Jewish denominations, and when I mean most, I mean certainly the Reform movement, the conservative movement, and also mainstream Orthodox movement in the early 20th century were all against Kabbalah, right? They didn't teach it. You would never hear anybody talking Kabbalah. If you entered any normal synagogue in the year 1900, if you took any probably normal class, intro to Judaism, intro to Jewish history, again, it doesn't matter if it's Reform or Orthodox. If it wasn't a Hasidic synagogue 100 years ago, you would not get any Kabbalah. And so Gershom Scholem became the first professor to hold a professorship of the study of Kabbalah. And so the head of JTS, I think in 1957, I just looked up the year earlier today. So sometime in the 1950s, Gershom Scholem was receiving an award from JTS. And so he got up to give his sort of grand lecture to accept his reward. And Saul Lieberman, who at the time was the head of JTS, infamously announced him by saying, "Stupidity is stupidity, but the study of the history of stupidity, that is scholarship." And with that, he invited Gershom Scholem up as the scholar to receive an award. And so all that's to paint the picture that the history and the study of Kabbalah comes with a lot of baggage. And it's going to be easy to see as we go into the next couple of weeks, because mysticism coincides with, its sort of sister ideology, which is Messianism. And Messianism in world history has always been associated with the breakdown of societies and demagogue leaderships. And anytime there's a messianic revolution going on, people are probably getting hurt and society's probably falling apart. And so all that's to say, everything we're studying today, again, this is far before any messianic fervor in Judaism, which we had a lot of in the 15 and 1600s, which we'll talk about later. But this is all coming with that sort of academic historical baggage. Okay, so let me share my screen and just give a couple more introductory remarks, and then we will hop right into some sources here. So just as one more framing here, I always feel the need to give this other caveat, which is mysticism by definition is not rational. And what I mean by that isn't that everything I'm going to say today is gibberish, but unlike Maimonides, where he tries to build up a philosophic argument where you have premises and conclusions and it follows logically and one can agree or disagree based on following the logic or disagreeing with the premise, Kabbalah doesn't try to self-contain its own logic. So in Kabbalistic sources, you'll get a lot of premises or ideas thrown out there, and there's no internal attempt to explain why this is so. And so there's an interesting quote from Sefer HaBahir, which is a later Kabbalistic work, but it sort of preps the learner for Kabbalah, which says, "Whoever delves into mysticism cannot help but stumble. As it is written, the stumbling block is in your hand. You cannot grasp these things unless you stumble over them." And so again, a wider picture of Jewish mysticism that, again, from the root of mysticism, there is some mystery that's kept there. And a lot of the adherents and a lot of modern day Kabbalistic thinkers like Kabbalah specifically for the reason of it maintains some mystery in the worldview and the universe and in Judaism, unlike other forms of Judaism, such as Maimonides, that almost seems to suck all of the mystery out of it. Okay, last thing that I will say, and then I can take some questions for introduction before we actually start. So just a quote from Moshe Idel, who's one of the foremost scholars on contemporary Kabbalah, and he sets us up quite nicely for where we are starting today, which is, again, we just learned about Maimonides and his rationalism last time. And so Professor Adel says, the rationalistic reconstructions of Judaism prompted in turn a powerful reaction wherein an amalgamation of older traditions, including the same mystical, mythical, and magical elements, came to the surface in more overt and crystallized forms. And so what Professor Adel is pointing out is we are going to, or I'm going to attempt to make an argument, and scholars make the argument, this isn't me pulling this out of my pocket, that what we know to be Kabbalah originated in medieval Spain, right? This is sort of beyond scholarly doubt at this point, right? The Zohar, which we'll talk about in probably 45 minutes, the magnum opus and central Kabbalistic book, was written by a Spanish Jewish thinker in the late 1200s, early 1300s in Spain. This doesn't mean that there's no mysticism prior to that in Judaism, right? Anybody here who studied sort of the enigmatic portions of the Tanakh or stories in the Talmud that deal with demons or ghosts or witches or all of these things knows that there was obviously mystical traditions that were in Judaism far before this. The difference is here they actually start to crystallize in actual worldview forms, which we'll see in a second. And so this isn't to say that a bunch of scholars sat around in the 1200s and sort of, dark smoke-filled rooms and came up with a complete new set of ideas about Judaism. But what they did, and actually it's funny because the root of the English word cabal comes from Kabbalah, right? It's the same word. And so it was a group of leaders, right? A cabal, if you will, right? That word obviously has a lot of modern baggage, but a group of leaders that sat there with a bunch of older mythical traditions and mystical traditions. And at a certain point, decided to write almost a guidebook or take all of these disparate mythological views and form it into one complete worldview. So just taking a step back, Ruth asked in the chat, and if anybody has questions, feel free, we'll take a minute now. Ruth says, what does Kabbalah mean, right? It's a great question. So the root of Kabbalah is from the Hebrew word kabel, and it just means to receive. And so the idea of Kabbalah, and this is something that we've actually talked about before with a lot of Jewish texts, but I think it's just helpful to go over it again. There's an idea in a lot of traditions, and I don't just mean religious traditions. I think this is actually also true in American political life, let's say, where to some extent, the older a text is, the more weight it's given in that legal tradition. And so, right, this is obviously true in Judaism, right? If the Torah says something, that carries a lot more weight than if some random rabbi in the year 2023 says something, right? If the Talmud says something, that carries more weight than if some rabbi in the 1900s said something. And so there's always this idea, even when new worldviews were being come up with in Judaism, to try to backdate it. And that's actually one of the interesting things we get with Kabbalah, right? The name of the study of Jewish mysticism is the receival, or a tradition that's received, because it's trying to highlight the point that, no, don't think that I'm making this up, or don't think that this is something new. This is something that's been part of our tradition forever. Right. And so the Kabbalists want to imagine that from the earliest days of Jewish tradition, from Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moses on Sinai, right, they were also practicing mysticism. It was just passed down generation to generation. And only at a certain point, the Jews were, quote unquote, ready for it. And so actually, if you were to do a quick Google search right now of who wrote the Zohar, right, the central Kabbalistic text, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, you'll actually get two different answers. One answer, you'll get the scholarly answer, which is a Spanish medieval Jewish thinker named Moses de Leon in the 1300s. The other answer, if you're on a more religious site, is you're going to get Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a first century sage, that sort of the pinnacle of his biography was the Talmud says that he had to live in a cave for 14 years. And so the story goes that the Kabbalists say is that when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was stuck in the cave for 14 years, and again, for those who have studied any Plato before, right, this is a parallel story to the story of Plato's cave, right, where somebody's sitting in a cave and seeing reflections of from the fire on the wall and thinks that's reality. And only after they go out of the cave, they realize that reality is actually the real world, right? Not the mirage on the walls. So the Talmud has their own mirror story where Rabbi Shimon is in a cave for 14 years, and then he emerges and discovers secrets. And so the sort of Kabbalistic internal narrative is that Kabbalah is a much more ancient tradition. So great question. And Ana Bakoach considered part of Kabbalah. So yeah, Yoel, it is. And one of the things that we get with Kabbalah is that today in Judaism, this will be the last thing I say in introduction, because I want to get into some text here. Today in Judaism, it's actually very hard to separate the influences of Kabbalah from what someone might call, I hate the term normative or historical or authentic, because those are all very loaded terms, and who's to say what's all of those things. But it is impossible now to separate Kabbalah from everything else we call Judaism, because everything we do as a Jewish community has been influenced by the Kabbalistic movement, right? The most famous example, by the way, is the service Kabbalah Shabbat, which all synagogues of every denomination do Friday night, right? Kabbalah Shabbat comes from the word Kabbalah. And Kabbalah Shabbat is, again, a Friday Eve prayer, right? It's before the traditional Mariv prayer. And so it's not one of the normal three, right? Shacharit, Mincha, Mariv. But it's this additional prayer that a group of Kabbalists in the Israeli northern city of Tzfat came up with in the 16 and 1700s. And they composed some of the songs they composed, some of it they took from the book of Tehillim, from Psalms, and they came up with quite a beautiful prayer service that we still do today. And so when we're saying that prayer service, are we engaging in a Jewish ritual, a Kabbalistic ritual, right? It's really hard to say. And so, right, part of this, and again, one of the interesting things of pulling back Jewish history and really looking at the bird's eye view, as we've done, right, from early Iron Age until, again, we'll get to 2023 eventually in a couple of weeks. One of the interesting things is seeing how when new social, ideological, and cultural movements arise, Judaism is very good at taking the good out of different cultures, different ideas, and all of those things, and sort of seemingly adding them to Judaism without skipping a beat, right? I think it's one of the Jewish secrets to success is that Judaism is not overly rejectionist when it comes to new things, and it's not overly accepting either, right? There's always this sort of dialectic back and forth. We're saying, okay, there's this new idea, let's scope it out, let's make sure that it's, for lack of a better term, kosher, that it won't hurt Jewish continuity, that it won't hurt our community. If it won't hurt our community in some significant way, let's see how we can adopt that practice into the rest of our Judaism, right? Obviously, not everybody agrees on where those lines are, which creates all the fun, different movements we have today. But as a general principle, that holds true. Okay, so we are going to meet these three figures today. And if anybody else has any questions, again, just feel free to cut me off. So I figured we would start with some art here. So all the way on the left, we have Judah Halevi. And Judah Halevi, and we'll go into each of these thinkers and sort of how they each helped put the puzzle pieces of Kabbalah in order in a second. But this is a statue that is right now somewhere in Caesarea, Israel. So Caesarea is, again, one of the ancient coastal cities of Israel, right? It's still a coastal city in Israel. It's a very beautiful place, both historically and modern. And this is Judah Halevi, who's probably best known for his poetry, right? He's the poet who wrote the famous poem, "My heart is in the east, but I am at the uttermost west." But he also wrote a book about Jewish thought, and I'm very consciously not calling it a book on Jewish philosophy. He wrote a book on Jewish thought called the Kuzari, which was sort of seen as a anti-philosophical polemic. Up next, we have the Ramban. This is a wall painting in the northern city on the coast in Israel of Akko. And the Ramban, or otherwise known as Nachmanides, again, don't mix that up with Maimonides, very confusing, right? But Nachmanides was also a Spanish Jewish thinker, and he was most well known for his commentary on the Torah, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And this statue is actually right now in Guadalajara, Spain. And this is Moses de Leon, the author of the Zohar. And so these are going to be sort of the three heavy hitters of medieval Spanish mysticism that we'll go through. And as you can see, right, this is over the course of about 200 years. And so again, just when studying overall historic movements, these things don't happen overnight. And we can see how these philosophies start to build on each other until eventually, when the time the Zohar comes, you have a full-fledged Jewish mystical movement that's starting. Okay, so the Kuzari was Judah Halevi's, again, one of his magnum opuses. And this, I think this will actually start a really interesting conversation. So just to introduce this book, because it really is one of the most unique Jewish books that I think we have today. So we've talked a ton in the last two sessions about, again, all of the ideological challenges that were happening to Jews in wider Spain, right? You had, right, and Spain, especially in the later medieval ages, was constantly in war between the Christian world that was in the north and the Islamic world, and you had Greek rationalism, and you had, the sort of fervent dogmatism of the Christian world. And so Jews that lived in medieval Spain were very thoughtful people, right? They were around a multiplicity of ideologies. And so you get a book by Judah Halevi that was called the Kuzari. Now, why did he call it the Kuzari? Well, because it was a very interesting historic episode. We actually didn't touch on this at all, but there was a really interesting historic episode that happened sometime in the 900s in the land of Khazar, which was up further in Central Europe, where a king and his 400 servants all decided to mass convert to Judaism. This is a really interesting historic tidbit on a complete tangent that I really don't want to get into. It's been falsely claimed, and I'm going to highlight the word false. It's been falsely claimed that all Ashkenazi Jews are actually descended from the Khazars. That's actually a very common argument that people that are trying to discredit the Jewish link to Israel try to use by saying, well, Ashkenazi Jews don't actually date back to ancient Israel because they're just descendant from the Khazars, right? Both historic and genetic testing have disproven that claim, but just in case you ever see it. But either way, there was this interesting historic episode that everybody in the Jewish world presumably knew about, where you had this king who decided to convert to Judaism randomly. And again, Judaism is not a tradition that had any power in the medieval world or very much cultural influence. And so somebody converting to Judaism, especially a person of high power and status in the year 900, was not like somebody today in America converting to Judaism, right? This was a crazy, almost unheard of historic episode. And so Judah Halevi decided that he was going to use this historic episode as a pretense to write a book of, I'll call it, historical philosophic fiction. And what do I mean by that? Well, he had a worldview of Judaism that he wanted to spread, right? He wanted to write a book, but rather well, oh, there I am. Sorry, I think I cut out for a second. Can everyone hear me? Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So Judah Halevi writes this book. And again, rather than title his book Judah Halevi and his new view of Judaism, Judah Halevi decides to write his book in this historic setting of imagining a hypothetical conversation between this Khazar king, a rabbi, a representative from the Christian world, a representative from the Muslim world, and a representative from the world of philosophy. And so he sets up this dialogue, again, somewhat similar to the way that Greek philosophic books were written, right? As in very much dialogue back and forth. And he, again, attempts to delineate his worldview of Judaism. And so in the intro, it sets up the situation, and we'll see why this is interesting and why Judah Halevi puts forth a worldview that was so different than Maimonides. So he writes, when the king of Khazar, as is related, dreamt that his way of thinking was agreeable to God, but not his way of acting, and was commanded in the same dream to seek the God-pleasing work, he inquired of a philosopher concerning his religious persuasion. So already, this is the way that the book opens. And already we should be having some alarm bells in our head going off, because this is a very interesting way to describe or personify this king. And what I mean by that is, what Judah Halevi is saying, and what he sets up his entire book, again, we don't have time to do a full study of the entirety of the Kuzari, but what his argument ends up being, which will become more clear in a second, is that Judaism is not about ideas at all. It's not about belief. What is it about? It's about action. And so Judah Halevi thought being Jewish meant acting a certain way. It didn't mean having any type of specific ideological or philosophic views about God. And so, again, we can complicate that picture a little bit, but even from the introduction, he introduces the king as somebody who, again, had all the right views. He just didn't have the right way of practice. Now, if we remember back to, again, last session in Maimonides was the exact opposite, because Maimonides was all about ideas, right? For Maimonides, Judaism was a system of truths, and it was a system of truths that, in order to package those truths from one generation to the next, well, you add in some ritual and some actions. But if we try to ask Maimonides, what is the essential part of Judaism, it would be those truth claims. And so even if asking a question to Maimonides, if Maimonides were to pop into the Zoom chat right now, and we were to ask him, what is the difference between Judaism, Islam, Christianity, other religious traditions, he would say, well, Judaism has access to certain truths that those religious traditions don't have access to. Now, again, we can disagree with Maimonides, but that's almost certainly what he would say, right? And he was, again, a philosophic thinker. And so he believed in the methods of rationality and science in order to tease out truths. And so, again, that was Maimonides. Judah Halevi introduces a new way to conceptualize of Judaism, or maybe he's reestablishing the old way, right? That's for you all to figure out and debate about at home. But Judah Halevi suggests that Judaism is all about action. And so the Khazar king, again, asks back to him, right, the question that you can imagine, which is, well, how do you know that your ideas about what to do are right, right? Lots of people have action. And this is what the rabbi says in Judah Halevi's Kuzari. So the rabbi says, I believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, who led the children of Israel out of Egypt with signs and miracles, who fed them in the desert and gave them the land after having brought them through the sea and the Jordan in a miraculous way. Now ask the philosophers, and you will find that they do not agree on one action or one principle, since some doctrines can be established by arguments which are only partially satisfactory and still much less capable of being proved. And so Judah Halevi makes two important claims here that are going to start a completely new Jewish worldview, one in which a lot of people today might be familiar with. But Judah Halevi establishes, and if you read through the rest of the Kuzari, it's all about these two principles. The reason why Judaism is quote unquote correct or true is not because of any wider philosophic or scientific or rationalistic claims. It's because of our tradition. What does it mean by our tradition? Well, if my parents told me that their parents told them, that their parents told them, and so forth, that one day God took us out of Egypt, that is a truth claim, again, not based on science or rationality or philosophy. That's a truth claim based on, to some extent, identity, right? I believe in the God of the Jewish people, right? Not a God that can be proved in a laboratory, not a God that can be proved by scientific premises. And then he even goes on to attack philosophers. What do I mean by that? He says, and he develops this argument a little further, he says, you ask a group of philosophers what is true and how one should act, and they all disagree, right? You can't get the same answer from every single philosopher. And so he says, well, therefore, philosophy, and follow this argument for a second, we can attack it in a moment, but just to understand what Judah Halevi was talking about, he says, the epistemological or the truth claims of philosophy fall apart because all of the leaders in the field can never agree on anything. And even the most basic philosophic claim of what is right, of what is true, is a subject of debate among philosophers. And so in that sort of a one sweeping argument, he basically discredits the entire field of philosophy. And now again, this is at a time in medieval Spain when lots of young Jews were grappling of how to deal with the truth claims of philosophy, right? If this is going to sound a bit anachronistic, but if your child or you went off to college in medieval Spain in the year 1100 and they were sitting in their college class, their biggest threat to their Jewish identity would be taking a introduction to Greek philosophy class. They would hear all these ideas that challenge Judaism, and then they would run home and say, well, Judaism is not true anymore, right? So we already saw Maimonides' answer, which was to write a book called The Guide to the Perplexed that basically tells that child, don't worry, you can study your Greek philosophy, that's true. You can study Judaism, that's true. And here's why they're both true, right? Judah Halevi is coming at it from a completely different direction. He's saying, well, what do those philosophers know, right? Ask 3 of them the same question. You'll get 10 different answers on what the right way to live a life is, or what a good life is, or what is true, right? Whereas we have this inherited tradition that we all, to some large picture extent, agree upon. Obviously, we disagree on the nuances of it, but we all agree on Shabbat. We all agree, again, this is in the 1100s, we all agree on the laws of kosher generally. We all agree on the holidays of Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And so he comes up with this worldview that can best be summed up as, right, a lot of scholars call Judah Halevi the anti-philosopher, because he writes this magnum opus of Jewish philosophy, the Kuzari, but he spends the entire time attacking all of the claims of philosophy and claims that can be come to outside of Judaism. And at the end of the day, he says, well, the only reason why we know what we do is right is because of that inherited tradition. So if you were to ask Judah Halevi the same question we posed to Maimonides, and you were to say, what differentiates Judaism from Christianity, from Islam, from, let's say, Karaitism, which was a Jewish sect that broke off mainstream Judaism in the medieval ages, he would say, well, perhaps everybody is equally correct in terms of their philosophic theological claims, right? Jews believe in God, Christians believe in God, Muslims believe in God, Karaites believe in God, right? We're probably all equivalent on the truth claims. What differentiates Judaism as a system of ideas, right? It's our action, right? It's our way of doing things, right? It's the mitzvot. And so just one other way to summarize this, we'll see Menachem Kellner, who's a well-known, again, Jewish academic, and he puts it quite nicely. He says that Halevi, right, Judah Halevi sees Jewishness as a matter of hardware. Maimonides insists that it's a software, right? So just to again summarize, right, Maimonides thinks it's all about the ideas, right? Actions are secondary, right? As long as we're agreeing on our baseline philosophic claims, right, I can be a pluralist in terms of actions, right? Maimonides comes across as much more of an action pluralist, right? He had no patience for what he considered false beliefs, but as long as everybody agreed with his underlying claims of philosophy, practice to some extent however you want. Judah Halevi is the opposite. Judah Halevi would have said, well, sitting in a class endlessly debating about God and truth and all these things, right? That's a waste of time. We're never going to agree anyway, right? What's important in Judaism? It's the action. And this sets up a worldview which will then later on be developed by the Kabbalists, right? We'll see why this is our first stop in developing Kabbalah, because one of the things that Kabbalah introduces into Judaism, right, I'm skipping to the end a little bit, is an enormous focus on action over belief, right? What's the most explicit example of this, right, in our modern world? Probably everybody here has interacted with a Chabad rabbi at some point in their life, right? And everybody knows, right, one of the things that Chabad is well known for is standing around trying to get Jews to do mitzvot, right? Whether it's to get Jewish males to put on tefillin, or on Sukkot to get Jews to shake the lulav, or even just to say a blessing, right? If we were to unpack, right, why in Hasidic Judaism is there such a focus on doing the right action, even if the person doing it really has no idea why they're doing it, they can't explain to you the ideas behind it, right? They can't explain to you the correct ways of doing it, right? It all kind of goes back to this initial seed planted by Halevi, which is to say, forget about the ideas, right? Forget about knowing what's true and why it's true and why we do it. What's important is that my dad put on tefillin, his dad put on tefillin, his dad put on tefillin, and all of the dads back into Moses put on tefillin. Therefore, putting on tefillin is an act that is true, even if when I'm sitting in a philosophic debate and somebody says, why are you tying leather to your arms? I would have no good argument to convince them, right? That's Halevi's argument in a nutshell. Now, just to get our historic timeline right, Judah Halevi was half a generation before Maimonides. And so there's an interesting trend that happened where, again, the philosophic revolution in Judaism happened right before Maimonides, right? Maimonides was, again, the face of it, but we discussed, I think, 2 sessions ago, even Saadia Gaon and other Sephardic Jewish thinkers started this philosophic revolution. And so Moshe Habrotal, who's the one of the top scholars in Maimonides, writes this really interesting line in one of his essays where he says, the Kuzari was the response to the Guide to the Perplexed before it was even written. So what does he mean by that? That Judah Halevi is the perfect response to Maimonides, even though, of course, he never met Maimonides, right? He died right as Maimonides was probably in diapers still. But this is the anti-Maimonides worldview, right? If Maimonides is all about ideas and about truth and about philosophy, Judah Halevi opens up Judaism now for a tradition that is all about action and doing the right thing. Now, again, in our worldview today, those don't have to be binaries, but just to start to see this debates that were going on in medieval Spain. Taking a step back, any thoughts or questions before we move to our next step? Is anything still a little lost? Anyone a little confused here?
Is he responding to anyone at all? Because my first thought was that he had to be responding to Maimonides, because the anonymous narrator introduction that he has almost seems like he's answering or being baited with a question to give this text.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is of course, right? And I don't know if he's responding to an individual. Again, this was the culture, or especially in intellectual circles. Again, there's always this interesting academic question of how much the average Jew that was living in Spain in the year 1050 was privy to these debates, right? There's a bunch of different scholarly opinions there, but let's assume most Jews knew what was going on in terms of these wider debates, right? Even before Maimonides, there were still Jews that were grappling with philosophy and a lot that started to accept it, and there were still Jews that were trying to reject philosophy. Maimonides happened to be the best argued and best put together Jewish philosophic book. But even 100 years before Maimonides, right? I think I mentioned Saadia Gaon 2 sessions ago. Saadia Gaon wrote also a book of philosophy where he started to lay the groundwork for what Maimonides did. It's interesting. There was an article in the Atlantic a few weeks ago. I'm forgetting the author, but it was basically saying the title was "The Eureka Theory of History is Wrong." That was the title, if anybody's curious. And one of the things that they argue at the outset, and I found this an interesting argument when thinking about Jewish history, is we often associate things in history either with singular actions or singular figures. And so I can sit here and I would be completely correct in saying, well, Maimonides started a rationalistic revolution and Judah Halevi started this mystical revolution, and sort of equating movements with individual events or thinkers. And this article in the Atlantic was basically saying, well, history obviously works much slower than that, right? It's not as if, let's use a more modern example. It's not as if Theodor Herzl, right, the founder of political Zionism, took the idea of Zionism out of nowhere, right? Jews had been talking about it not only for thousands of years, but even in the mid 1800s, there were a lot of people that were talking about maybe creating some sort of Jewish state. Theodor Herzl was just the first person to say, let me actually write a systematic argument and set up a roadmap for how this will actually happen. And so history works a lot more in that second paradigm where Maimonides, again, was a very unique figure, and Judah Halevi were very unique, but to some extent they were giving voice to already, changing ideological tides that were happening. So it's a really good question. And the answer is sort of yes and no, where a lot of Maimonides' ideas probably were existing in some sense before Maimonides, and Judah Halevi's ideas probably were existing before him. Great question, Maddie. Any other questions, thoughts before we move on a little bit? Perfect. Okay. So we'll get to our second philosopher, right? So that is Nachmanides, who again, if we just to go to the dates real quick, right? So Judah Halevi was 1070 to 1141, right? And these were all medieval Spanish thinkers, right? So these are all in the same place, right? Same general medieval time period. And this is all just, I said this 2 weeks ago, this is all in the time period and era of what people think of as the golden age of Spain, right? I know that's a very loaded term because obviously Jews had probably the best freedom they had in the ancient world, right? It still would not be considered equal freedom to what we understand today, but this was a time in Jewish history where there was a lot of freedom to think about ideas because there wasn't as big of a worry of Jews getting killed, right? Next week, we'll talk about medieval anti-Semitism, because I think it's an important chapter along our trek through Jewish history. And right, we'll paint a very different story of other parts of Europe. And then, of course, after the Christian world ends up taking over Spain, right, it resulted in the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion, which is probably one of our darkest periods in history, if not the darkest pre-Holocaust period of Jewish history. But we'll get to that next week. Okay, so Nachmanides, or the Ramban, or Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, right, however we want to call him, right, so he was the generation or 2 generations after Judah Halevi. And Nachmanides, again, is perhaps the best well known for his commentary on the Torah. And so, right, anytime you open, let's say, Sefaria, we did this a couple weeks ago, so I won't do it again, but he is probably number 2 in terms of famous Torah commentators, right? The most famous is Rashi, right? He was the French sage, right? The French exegete. But what Rashi did, and we discussed this 2 weeks ago, but just to review a little bit, Rashi wasn't so much of an innovator. What Rashi was best used for is almost like being an ancient hyperlink, if you will, right? Rashi was very good, right? He had somewhat of an encyclopedic memory of Jewish texts. And every time he saw something in the Torah, he would say, hey, wait a minute, that reminds me either of this other part of the Torah, or that reminds me of this piece of the Talmud, or that reminds me of this rabbinic midrash. Let me write my commentary by quoting all of these different pieces of rabbinic literature and fusing it into one commentary on this verse. So again, obviously takes a lot of wisdom and intelligence and all of these things, but he wasn't as much of an inventor. He was much more of a, let's say, somebody who gathers material. Nachmanides, probably the second most important commentator on the Torah, right? He created a mystical commentary on the Torah. And so if you read Nachmanides on the weekly Parsha every week, you are going to get a commentary on the Torah that is infused with a mystical gloss and worldview that seems completely foreign if you were to actually read the Torah. And I wanted to give one of the more explicit examples, and now we can continue our trek into medieval mysticism. So there are a lot of examples that I could have chosen, but let me use the example of what it means when the Torah says you should not utilize the services of sorcerers or witches, right? So I just want to read these verses, and then we can go over some potential ways to explain what the heck the Torah is talking about, right? So for those who have studied the books of either Leviticus or Deuteronomy, right, these types of verses will not be new to you. The book of Deuteronomy says, when you enter the land that Hashem your God is giving you, you shall not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. Let no one be found among you who consigns a son or daughter to the fire, who is an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, one who inquires of the dead. For anyone who does such things is abhorrent to God, and it is because of these abhorrent things that your God, Hashem, is dispossessing them before you. You must be wholehearted with God. Okay, there are 2 very different ways to explain these verses, right? The 2 ways are evident, right? Why are we not allowed to do these things? Is it because A, they're not true, and it's a waste of time and might lead to other bad things, right? That would be Maimonides' answer, right? So if you ask Maimonides, well, why am I not, as a Jew, allowed to go to a sorcerer or a necromancer who will try to conjure up spirits of my dead great-grandparents and have them speak to me, Maimonides would say, and he does say, because that's stupidity, right? And stupidity is the antithesis of Judaism, which is truth, right? That is Maimonides' worldview. Now, there's another way to read these stories, and another way to read why the Torah is so against witchcraft and voodoo, and even to some extent idolatry. That way suggests, well, wait a minute, maybe there actually is some truth to this. Maybe it's just tapping into the wrong sources. And so the wrongness of idolatry, according to this worldview, might be not because you're doing something not true, right? It's not ideological. It's that you're doing something in the wrong way, right? You are practicing in the incorrect manner, right? And this is an interesting worldview that Nachmanides develops throughout his entire commentary on the Torah. One interesting example just to consider that he uses as one of his main proof texts, and Nachmanides and Maimonides argue a ton about this. I remember always being very confused in high school whenever my rabbis would say Maimonides and Nachmanides, because I would always mix them up because they sound very similar. But right, the Torah is very against idolatry, right? From the first story, right, we'll read it in Shul in a couple weeks, right, of the golden calf, right? We all understand, right, the Torah is against making things out of gold and worshiping them. And I see a couple of nods in the Zoom, right? Everybody here seems to intuitively agree. But then we spend half of the book of Exodus and half the book of Leviticus talking about this Mishkan, a tabernacle that God commands Moses to build that has tons of things of gold. And the Jewish people are supposed to offer incense there and offer sacrifices there. And so there's a problem here, which is, what is the difference between building a golden calf and building a golden altar that you're going to offer things on, right? Is this a problem, in other words, of philosophy or theology, or of incorrect action? And so again, Maimonides takes pains to argue that this is a problem of ideology. But what the Ramban says, or Nachmanides says, is not that there's something inherently true or false about building things out of gold and worshiping with them, but it's that in one case, God commanded it, in one case, God didn't. End of story, right? It's not that there's anything inherently good or bad about building a golden calf and worshiping it. What was bad about building the golden calf is that they were doing something that God did not command. In the same vein, what was good about building their tabernacle was that God commanded it. But there's no attempt to differentiate based off of philosophy there. And so Nachmanides, right, again, you can see now how this continues from Judah Halevi's action-centric view, right? It's the action that makes Judaism, not the ideas behind it. And so Nachmanides gives his commentary on here, right, as to why the Torah does not want us consulting soothsayers and diviners and witch doctors and all these things. And so here is what he says about sorcery. Know and understand concerning the subject of sorcery, that when the Creator, blessed be He, created everything from nothing, He made the higher powers guides for those below them. So already now, I'm hoping for anybody who's paying attention, right? There's a, wait, what did he just say moment? Because he uses powers plural, right? So he's already introducing the idea that there is more than one power, right? Now, Maimonides, again, staunch monotheist, right? Everything comes from one truth source. That truth source is God, right? Now, Nachmanides is saying that when God created the world, He created a bunch of higher powers, right? What does he go on to say? Thus, He placed the earth and all the things that are thereon in the power of the stars and constellations, depending on their rotation and position, as proven by the study of astrology, right? So Nachmanides is saying, well, you know, the zodiac signs and the astrological signs, well, yeah, of course, God created that. Over the stars and constellations, He further appointed guides, angels, and lords, which are the souls of the stars and constellations. So he says, not only did God create the stars to be in certain signs, but each star gets its own angel, which means it gets its own soul, which means that there are autonomous mystical beings that are not God that are around, right? Some may call them angels, some may call them spirits, whatever term we want to give to them. Their behavior from the time they come into existence for eternal duration is according to the pattern the Most High decreed for them, right? So then he puts a stopgap, right? He doesn't want you to conclude that he is a polytheist. So he says, well, all of these other powers, again, they're only, right? They're only there doing what God wants them to. But he says, however, it was one of his mighty wonders that within the powers of the higher forces, he put configurations and capacities to alter the behavior of those under them. Thus, if the direction of the stars towards the earth be good or bad to a certain country, people, or individual, the higher dominions can reverse it of their own volition. As they have said, the opposite of the word oneg, pleasure, is nega, plague. God ordained it because blessed be he changes the times and the seasons, right? And now here is how he concludes, and then we will unpack all this, right? He calls for the waters of the sea to do with them at his will and brings on the shadow of death in the morning without changing the natural order of the world. And it is he who made the stars and constellations move about in their order, right? Here's where we get to the crux. Therefore, the author of the Book of the Moon, right? We don't actually know. This is a historic tangent. We're not sure what he's describing Book of the Moon, but it seems to be some occult, polytheistic, or idolatrous book, not dissimilar to, again, if somebody were to go to a modern day, right, palm reader or something like that, right? The expert in the field of necromancy said, when the moon, termed the sphere of the world, for example, is at the head of Aries, and the constellation thus appears in a certain form, you should make a drawing of that grouping, engraving it on the particular time when this relative position appears, and the name of the angel, one of the names mentioned in the book, appointed over it, then performed a certain burning of incense in a specific manner, and the result of the influence of the relative position of the stars will be for evil, to root out, and to pull down, and to destroy and overthrow. And when the moon will be in a position relative to some other constellation, you should make the drawing and the burning in a certain other manner, and the result will be for good, to bud, and to plant, right? If all these details are lost, they're also lost on me, right? So this is just for the overall sentiment here. So he says, now this too is the influence of the moon as determined by the power of its heavenly guide. But the basic manner of its movement is by the wish of the Creator, blessed be he, who endowed it so in time past, while this particular action is contrary thereto, right? Now we get to the end here, right? This then is the secret of all forms of sorcery and their power, concerning which the rabbis have said that they contradict the power of divine agency, meaning that they are contrary to the simple powers with which agencies have been endowed and thus diminish a certain aspect of them. Therefore, it is proper that the Torah prohibit these activities in order to let the world rest in its customary way, which is the desire of the Creator. This is also the reasons for the prohibition of mixing seeds, right? Don't worry about that for now. For the planting resulting from such graftings are strange, giving rise to change in the ordered course of the world for good and bad, aside from the fact that they themselves constitute a change in creation, as I have already explained. So, right, if all the details of the moon incense ritual are lost on us, right, what Nachmanides is describing here is, one, he is validating the essential truth claims of idolatrous practice, right? He says that there are people that, based off of their view of constellations and the moon and shadows and all these things, make drawings and offerings and incense in certain times. And he says that is totally true, right? What's wrong with this practice? Well, God set up the world in a certain way, and you're altering with the way that God wanted to set up the world, right? In other words, what's wrong with idolatry, according to Nachmanides, right? Here's why you see this became such a big debate in medieval Judaism. What's wrong with idolatry, according to Nachmanides, is not that idolatry is theologically false. It's that by doing the act of idolatry, you are messing with the cosmos in a way that God didn't intend to, right? You are worshiping in the wrong way, not you're worshiping the wrong thing, right? And then, of course, he directly attacks Maimonides here, right? So he says, now many scholars dispose themselves to be liberal with regard to these enchantments by saying that there is no truth in them whatsoever, right? So now this is a nod to the rationalists. And he says, well, I've read Maimonides, right? And he actually quotes extensive from Maimonides in his commentary, always to reject him. But he concludes here by saying, but there is a secret to this matter. We have already made known that the constellations have lords that lead them, these being the souls of the circuit of the spheres, and the lords of the tail and head of Aries are near the earth, these being termed the princes of the quiver that make the future known. It is through them that the signs in the birds indicate things to come, not for long durations or distant futures do they tell, but only of events that are about to happen. Some make them known by utterance of bitter sounds resembling wailing over the dead, and some by spreading their wings. This is what has been said, for a bird of the air shall carry the voice, a reference to those who suggest by their wings. So again, I didn't personally understand all of the details of the winged bird ritual, but all this is to say everything we've been saying before, right? Nachmanides validates the truth claims of all of the other religious traditions, idolatry, astrology, right? Any of these claims that from some perspective you would say are antithetical to Judaism, Nachmanides would say, yes, they are antithetical to Judaism because you're practicing in the wrong way, right? You're tapping into the cosmos in a way that God did not intend, but not because it's false, right? And Nachmanides goes on and in other places, and again, this is not an isolated comment, right? He keeps on referencing in his commentary, we have already made known, as we said elsewhere, right? So his entire commentary on the Torah is full of these references of the reason why idolatry is so bad is because you're tapping into, sometimes he even alludes to the fact that there are negative or evil spirits happening, right? So this already, right, you can imagine if you are a typical mainstream monotheist, certainly a Jewish monotheist that has been influenced by Greek philosophy that suggests a much more deistic God, you're not going to like this, right? This seems very, to some extent, polytheistic, right? You're introducing into the world angels and demons and all of these other types of powers that are, by definition, anti-rational. And so Nachmanides starts a mainstream movement in Judaism. Again, not him by himself, but in medieval Spain, you now start to see the proliferation of different mystical types of ways of thinking, of talking, of even acting Jewish, right? Just one interesting historic example is even from the times of the Talmud, amulets were a thing, right? And what's an amulet? An amulet is, let's say the most famous example of an amulet is you have a newborn baby and you want that baby to be protected from demons or illness, depending on if you ask Nachmanides or Maimonides, how do you protect the baby from illness? Well, Nachmanides would say illness is caused by evil spirits. Therefore, if you want to protect against evil spirits, you have to write an amulet with certain prayers that protect against evil spirits and hang that above the baby's crib, right? And so starting again from this time in medieval Spain, amulets and these sort of protective prayers and all of these things became a big part of a lot of people's Jewish practice, right? A contemporary example, by the way, of today, I don't know if anybody here has ever heard the idea that if something bad is happening to you, you should check your mezuzahs. I'm curious if anybody here has heard that practice. But there's a practice, again, originating from a lot of Hasidic communities that suggests that if, let's say, misfortune after misfortune is happening, right? Somebody hits you in a parking lot, and then the next day, I don't know, you lose all your money in the stock market, and then the next day, right, you break your arm, right? And you go to a Hasidic rabbi, they would say, well, probably something's wrong with your mezuzahs, right? Go and check to make sure that all the wording is right, right? That way of thinking is directly from Nachmanides, right? And this type of worldview, because it's saying, yes, there is in the cosmos evil spirits and good spirits, and all of Judaism is, in a sense, this cosmic battle to try to make sure that the good spirits overpower the evil spirits. But that every time you do something in Judaism, you are affecting the cosmos in some fundamental way. Now, if you ask Maimonides, why are Jews supposed to put up a mezuzah on their doorpost? He would say, well, it's probably helpful for an individual to always consider their identity. And if you're creating a house, you want that house to have values. And Judaism has some very good and true values. And so you want to make sure that every time you enter and exit your house when you're about to go to work for the day, you have your mezuzah on the wall and you pass it and you remember all the mitzvot. And right, we can understand how Maimonides would describe this, right? Nachmanides, right, would go in a completely different direction. Is there any at this point, right? So we have one more step, right? This is all to set up, I guess, for the grand finale, because now hopefully I think a lot of the puzzle pieces of Kabbalah will become a lot more clear rather than them just being presented as a random set of ideas that make no sense out of context. I think now when we introduce a lot of the ideas of early Kabbalah, we'll see how they immediately flow from these other two ideas, right? From Judah Halevi, again, made Judaism about action, right, over certain philosophy, right? Nachmanides takes that to a new level by suggesting that Judaism is this cosmological battle between certain spirits and other spirits, and it's the right type of action done in the right way is what is true, not the ideas behind it necessarily. So before we go to our last step, any thoughts or questions or clarifications here? Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to guess that everybody has at least seen this before, even if you've never really understood what it means. And this is known as the 10 Sfirot, or the 10 spheres. And this is the main thesis of the book, the Zohar. And so just to, I apologize if I give anybody motion sickness here, but just to put us on the map here, right? So now we are going to the, right, Moses de Leon was, right, he was alive towards the end of Nachmanides' life, right? So they overlapped for a little bit in Spain. We don't know if they actually ever met, but Moses de Leon was certainly influenced by Nachmanides and his way of viewing Judaism. And so Moses de Leon comes, right? Again, this is not a very nice statue, but it's a statue of him. I'm sure it was nice 600 years ago. So scrolling back down. So Moses de Leon takes all of these ideas and he tries to say as follows. Okay, we have these two competing movements in Judaism, right? And this is going to require, right, a little bit of a couple premises and conclusions, right? So I can explain this a couple times if it's not clear. We have two competing movements in Judaism. We have the movement of Maimonides and his staunch rationalism that's also staunch monotheism, that basically suggests God exists, but God is the animating force behind everything in the universe. And so therefore there's God, and right, it's sort of a type of total deistic worldview where there's no room for God to interact with the world, right? Maimonides was a rationalist and a naturalist, right? According to Maimonides' worldview, things in the world happen naturally, right? God was there to infuse the universe with truths that could be discovered, but you can never describe something happening in the world as, well, God wanted that to happen, right? We discussed that 2 weeks ago, right? That, according to Maimonides, was ipso facto false, right? Anytime you make a positive claim about God, that was not true. So you have that view of Maimonides. Then you had this mystical view that was almost the exact opposite, that was painting the universe as this cosmological battle of good forces and evil forces, and God being sort of the chief good, and all of these things that allows people to connect to God and to help God overcome these negative evil forces, right? A much less sort of deistic view of God, a view of God that is much more almost like, and no one goes as far as to say this, but it's almost as if God is just a much more powerful deity compared to all the other angels and demons that are around that are less powerful. Nobody says it like that, but that is one way to think of that. So Moses de Leon in the Zohar says, well, hey, wait a minute. What if both of those claims are true at the same time? What if actually Maimonides is correct, right? God is unknowable, untouchable, right? The ultimate truth and animating force behind everything, right? God is infinite, right? According to Maimonides, right? That's true, right? God will be called the Ein Sof, right? Ein Sof in Hebrew means the infinite without end, and that's true. But what if the mystics are also true in their sense that there are cosmological interactions and theology happening there? But what if we're just talking about two different aspects of God? What if there's the version of God that is the infinite God behind the scenes, and then there's the parts of God that interact with the world in different ways? this is the central thesis of the Zohar. How does God interact with the world in different ways? Well, what if God has these 10 different attributes, right? Keter, Chachma, Bina, Chesed, right? Crown or royalty, wisdom, mercy, splendor, foundation, all of these different aspects. And different things that happen in the universe is God acting according to different types of God's essence. And this doesn't contradict monotheism, Moses de Leon explains, because, well, this isn't the real God, right? This is just God's essence interacting with the universe. Again, if I'm not explaining this in a fully rational way, it's because at a certain point, this is not fully rational. But what if, again, you have this tree, right? You have these different attributes of God that are all interacting with the universe in different ways, and different things you do can tap into different parts of God's essence. And also God is infinite, unknowable, untouchable, like Maimonides. And so he writes the Zohar, which again is a lens in which to view the Torah, right? The Zohar is mostly just a commentary on the Torah also. And he brings a panentheistic view into Judaism, right? For those who have never heard the word panentheistic, it's when you say God is both, right? So there's monotheism, deism, pantheism, right? A pantheist is somebody who says God is the universe. A monotheist is somebody who says there's a universe and God and they're separate. A panentheist is somebody who says those claims are both true, right? The universe is both God, and there's also a God that exists outside of the universe. And so that is the lens that the Zohar brings to Judaism, right? So God is infinite, but then there's also different emanations of the divine that you could connect to. And we'll do a text in a minute that hopefully explains this a little bit clearer than I'm trying to. But this opens up a completely new Jewish worldview that attempts to infuse all of these different ideas. Again, this of course would be hated by the rationalists, right? So all of Maimonides and his students and the sort of rationalistic tradition that Maimonides started hated Kabbalah and the Zohar, and that continues even till today, 2023, right? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But what if God is defined as dynamic, right? And one of the terms that a lot of scholars use is that God is not a being, but God is a becoming, right? What that tries to mean is that the God of either the Torah or the God of Maimonides is a static God, right? It's a God that we think of as unchanging, right? If something's infinite, it's not changing, right? God of the Torah is not changing, right? But once there's all these different divine forces that are interacting with the world, perhaps there's actually some way that God is changing and the universe is changing. And perhaps the step that Kabbalah goes one step further, which we'll read about in a second, perhaps humans have something to contribute in that divine drama. And so probably the most, right, so just to fast forward in history a little bit, right, this won't mess us up chronologically, because this is the best stated of these ideas, right? To the person who spread these Kabbalistic ideas probably more than anybody else in history was a rabbi named Isaac Luria, or otherwise known by the acronym the Arizal. And if anybody here has ever traveled to Sfat in Israel, right, he was the chief rabbi of Sfat in the 1500s. Again, the years don't really matter here because now we're talking about this idea that Kabbalah brought to Judaism. But if anybody has ever wondered why Tzfat is usually associated with the city of mysticism, it's because of the Arizal, right? The Arizal was one of the top students of the Kabbalistic movement. And after the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain, a lot of Sephardic Jews moved to the north of Israel and Tzfat, and the Arizal started writing a ton, and him and his student Chaim Vital basically popularized all of these Kabbalistic ideas and sent it out to the world. And so here's how the Arizal describes, again, based off of the Zohar, the cosmic drama unfolding. So he says, know that before the emanations were emanated and the creatures were created, there was one simple supernatural light that filled the all existence, right? So in the beginning, right, quite literally, right, in the beginning, God created, right? What does that mean? Well, there was God. God was infinite, right? He was this infinite light, and there was nothing else, right? Basically, his bona fide monotheistic credentials, right? he is a monotheist, right? In the beginning, there was one. And there was no empty place, no empty space or void. All reality was filled with that simple, infinite light, right? But now a problem happened. What's the problem? Well, if God is infinite, right? This is a problem that a lot of medieval philosophers dealt with. If God is infinite, how is there room for anything else? Another way of saying that, if God knows everything, how is there room for free will? Or if humans are autonomous, how can that coincide with God being infinite? And so what does Kabbalah suggest? There was no category or beginning, no category of end. All was one unified, simple, undifferentiated, ubiquitous, and homogeneous, infinite light called the Or Ein Sof, right? The infinite. When it arose in his simple will to create worlds and emanate emanations to bring light, the perfection of his actions, his names, and his attributes, for the purpose of creating all the universe, he constricted his infinite essence away from the center point of his being, that is, from the very center of his light. He thus constricted that light, distancing it to the extremities around the center point, leaving a vacated space and hollowed void, right? This is what's known in Kabbalah as the concept of tzimtzum, right? The constriction. So step one of the Kabbalistic theological worldview is, in the beginning, there was a problem. If God is infinite and God wants to create an autonomous world, God needs to constrict God's self, right? This is, again, what's known as tzimtzum, right? It's the basis of a lot of Kabbalistic worldviews. So, behold, after this constriction, which resulted in the creation of a vacated space and hollow void in the very midst of the infinite light, there was a place for all that was to be emanated, created, formed, and completed. He then drew forth a simple straight ray from his infinite encompassing light into the vacated space, right? Then what happened, right? When God decided to bring the world into being to make room for creation, he first drew in his breath, contracting himself. From that contraction, darkness was created. And when God said, let there be light, the light that came into being filled the darkness, and 10 holy vessels came forth, each filled with a primordial light. So if we're wondering where the sphirot, where the different divine essences come from, that is the 10 buckets or vessels of light that God is shooting into the universe after constricting himself, right? So already we're opening up, right? Just to peel behind the curtains for a second, God is opening up Kabbalistic worldview to both monotheism, but also this type of panentheism, or if you want to be hypercritical, almost somewhat polytheism, because he's saying, yes, sure, there was this infinite God in the beginning, but then God actually created other things that have their own powers, right? And now we get to the kicker, and we'll probably end in a couple of minutes. I know today was probably the most ideas-heavy day we've had, and I know a couple of people need to head out in a few minutes. This is also being recorded if people do need to leave a few minutes early. In this way, God sent forth those 10 vessels like a fleet of ships, each carrying its cargo of light. Had they all arrived intact, the world would have been perfect. But the vessels were too fragile to contain such a powerful divine light. They were broke open, split asunder, and all the holy sparks were scattered like sand, like seeds, like stars. Those sparks fell everywhere, but more fell on the Holy Land than everywhere else. That is why we were created, to gather the sparks no matter where they are hidden. God created the world so that the descendants of Jacob could raise up the holy sparks. That is why there's been so many exiles, to release the holy sparks from the servitude of capacity. In this way, the Jewish people will sift all the holy sparks from the four corners of the earth. And when enough holy sparks have been gathered, the broken vessels will be restored, and tikkun olam, the repair of the world awaited so long, will finally be complete. Therefore, it should be the aim of everybody to raise these sparks from wherever they are imprisoned and to elevate them to holiness by the power of their soul. This is, by the way, just to predict a question, this is the first time that tikkun olam is used in the sense of repairing the world in Judaism. And so the term tikkun olam, that today a lot of people translate usually as social justice, comes from this Kabbalistic view of quite literally repairing the world. But when Kabbalah talks about repairing the world, this is not in a, well, if I give a little bit more charity, I'm repairing the world, right? That might be part of it. But what Kabbalah does for Judaism to some extent is to turn Judaism into this wider cosmic drama, where not only is Jewish action important for you and for maybe the world, but actually it's important for God. That humans or God actually needs some sort of fixing, right? There's actually some fundamental brokenness in the universe, right? The state of the universe, right? As some other Kabbalistic thinkers say, the state of the universe is in a state of exile. And the purpose of humans, or more specifically Jews, right? Kabbalah ends up being a lot more, shall we say, Jewish-centric than Maimonides, who tends to be more of a universalist. That's for another conversation. But the point of Judaism, according to the Kabbalists, is we are here to fix God. How do we fix God? We do mitzvot, because every time we do a mitzvah, we are finding a piece of light and we are putting it back, right? We are fighting the darkness of the universe with a piece of light. This worldview, you can see this gradual growth, because this is the pinnacle of a actions are central worldview, right? We've left out all philosophy, right? To some extent, philosophy is out the window, right? It doesn't make a difference if you sit around and if Henry says, well, I believe this about God, and Shirley says, well, I believe this about God, and Mark has a third opinion, and I have a fourth opinion, right? From this worldview's perspective, none of that makes any difference, right? Great, we can debate about God all day, we're never going to agree. What is important? What's important is that we are doing mitzvot, right? And again, this, just to unpack, right? Not that this is the point of the class by any means, but now it's more understandable why, let's say, the Hasidic movement, which is the community that is the most infused with Kabbalistic ideas, is so focused on action. Because if a Chabad rabbi gets somebody to put tefillin on, it's not just that you're benefiting that person. Fine. You are actually fixing the cosmos of the universe. That's something that's worth standing outside a subway for 12 hours a day, every day of your life to get to happen. Assuming, again, obviously, if you believe in this wider cosmological construct, right? So this view, right, coming from Kabbalah, again, comes onto the scene as a reaction to some extent to the rationalism of Maimonides. But now we're left in Judaism with, and this will be how we end today. And then again, I'm always happy to stay for questions. I'll unshare my screen so we can all see each other, at least for a few minutes here. This worldview, we've left the medieval period with two completely different constructs of Judaism, right? A hyper-rationalistic construct of Judaism that says Judaism can always be ideologically reconciled, and another opinion that basically is living completely outside of the world of trying to reconcile ideologies and is so action-centric that it doesn't make a difference, right, what any of us believe about anything, as long as we're doing the right action, right? If you tell a Chabad rabbi, by the way, sorry, I don't want to put on tefillin, I'm a staunch atheist, I'll say, great, put on tefillin anyway, right? We need you to add to the light, right? If you told a follower of Maimonides, right, sorry, I don't want to show up to synagogue, I'm a staunch atheist, they would say, well, you're the worst type of heretic, right? Let me convince you why you're wrong, right? Now again, obviously, whenever we have competing movements in Jewish history, right, both of these movements end up merging, right, to some extent, right? No Jew today is a only Maimonides Jew and rejects all the mysticism, and very few Jews, although there are more, are only mystical Jews and reject all of Maimonides. And so in the Jewish practice that probably all of us are engaged in, right, again, whether it's a Reform, conservative, Orthodox, right, you know, from the entire range, right, it's all infused with both of these ideas. But you can imagine, again, this communal debate that was happening, and we'll start next week with sort of a wider overview, right? We're going to stay in the Middle Ages next week, but we'll talk more about the Ashkenazi world, and we'll probably end up talking a lot more about anti-Semitism next week, because sadly, that was one of the major stories of medieval Ashkenazi anti-Semitism. And just to end off today's class and end off our chapter in Spain, right? Sadly, the Jewish tenure in Spain, which again was this 300-year period that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, was one of the richest time periods in history, right? Obviously that all came to an end once the church took over. The Inquisition started in 1391, and then by 1492, right, all the Jews were forcibly expelled from Spain, right? So Jewish history in Spain came to a close very quickly, right? And obviously Jews were given an ultimatum, right? Do you convert or do you leave? Right? About half of them converted, about half of them left. Even the ones that converted, there was some debate about how many were secretly Jewish or not. But this entire rich culture that produced biblical commentary, philosophy, poetry, art, right? A lot of things that we take for granted in Judaism today, right, came out of this unique time period of medieval Spain, where both the culture, the relative safety of the Jewish people, the different ideas that were interacting with the Jewish community were ripe for this, again, this fascinating community debate, of which we're still involved in to some extent today. Again, happy to stay for any questions, commentary, anything like that, but I will end the recording.